and that is, in what ways can contemporary Buddhism and Dharma practice be misleading in the context of modern life? And I'm going to put Jay on the pin and let him reflect on this for some time. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave, and hi everyone. It's fun to be visiting your sangha. So thank you so much for having me and being part of this conversation. Dave and I have been talking about doing this for some time, and after a few postponements, here we are. Um, so I feel like I want to start by telling a story, but maybe a pair of stories actually from the Pali Canon of Buddhism, which illustrate these two really different models or frames of enlightenment. And I think the meta story around them is just how that the process looks different for different people, and like it goes right to the very core, these of the sort of core teachings of the Buddha in the Pali Canon. And it's these two stories are the stories of the last moments of enlightenment, before enlightenment, of the Buddha and of one of the Buddha's main disciples, Ananda. The Buddha one is probably really well known, right? Keanu Reeves sits under a tree, and magical things happen to him. And probably a lot of you know that the last little bit of the story. So all kinds of exciting altered states happen, visions happen, recollections of past lives. And the final piece is actually really similar to in the novel and then another film, The Last Temptation of Christ. Like the last bit is the adversary, Mara, in the Buddhist text, saying you're not worthy. Like who the hell do you think you are to get enlightened? You haven't attained enough. You haven't whatever. It is a little bit similar to that imaginative rendition of Christ on the cross, where he too has a moment of doubt. Right, even in the Gospels, it's like, God, why have you forsaken me? Right at the moment of this transformation. In the Buddhist case, he points to the earth, and that's kind of a really rich gesture in a lot of ways. Traditionally, it's understood of like the earth is my witness. Like I've gone through all of these rebirths. I've done all of the work. I've done all these things. I do deserve to be here. And it's this real moment. I think it's lovely to think. Sometimes I think we skip to like the enlightened part of the Buddha story too quickly, right? It's like, here's somebody who tried a lot of different practices, probably like some of us in the Zoom room. Well, I was really into yoga for a while, then I got into meditation, then I did this other thing, and then I did this, and then I circled back around. That was the Buddha's life also. And there was this moment of like what gave him that release was saying, I am worthy. I'm okay. Like this is what, like I deserve this moment. And it's almost like the adversary showed up as doubt.
So it was this Smith, Dave Smith, and
Hold on a
oh,
second here.
So
Jay, you're going to have to unmute for me because I did to mute everybody else.
gotcha. So then the story of Ananda is like the opposite, right? If the Buddha sort of sits in his power, so to speak, and says yes, Ananda, so there's about to be a big conference of all of the arahants, the people who are fully enlightened, after the death of the Buddha, to sort of recount what the Buddha taught. And nobody knew that better than Ananda, right? Because he had been with the Buddha this whole time, and he had, said he had a great memory, but the only problem was he was only a stream enterer. He wasn't fully enlightened, so he didn't pass the entrance exam. Like he didn't fulfill the prerequisites for being part of the all arahants, conversation. And so they're like, Ananda, you better like get with it. So he's meditating all night before the conference is supposed to happen, and it's just not really happening for him. Like the big peak experience is not unfolding, and he finally like decides like, okay, I mean, that's not what it's going to be. There's a picture of the perfect life, and that's not what it's going to be for me. Like that's not who I am. The Buddha was like, yes, this is who I am. Ananda was kind of in this acceptance and a surrender. Like, I guess it's not going to turn out, life isn't going to turn out the way that I thought or the way that my community thought. It's not going to have that kind of happy ending to it. It's going to have this ending, and that's what it is. And it's in that moment of relinquishment. It's like in the text, he kind of is like laying down to go to sleep after meditating all night, that then he becomes fully enlightened. which I always like the trick. Like you can't fake it, you have to really, really surrender in order to have that. But that I love that there are these two polar opposite stories of awakening, right in the center of this Dharmic tradition. And I start with that story because I think there is a tendency to think that that's not how it is. That whatever this path is, it looks there. It may look different for each of us, and we know that. But I think there's still a voice in there that's like, oh, but it's supposed to look like this, or it's supposed to look like that. And that's in the tradition as well as in the packaging around the tradition. So, for example, the Theravadan tradition of Buddhism, which gave birth to the sort of Western insight tradition, was originally a monastic tradition, right? And the idea was you have to get all aspects of your life in order, including how you live and your livelihood and so forth. And that means a pretty intense dose of renunciation, right? Becoming a nun or a monk. And that bangs up against what I would call a sort of Western humanism that values householder life. And we actually has like a lot of positive values to that, right? So it's not like this is the first time this collision happened between a monastic ideal and living in the world. It also happened within the Buddhist world thousands of years ago, creating the Mahayana tradition, which had a whole other means of what it is to lead a good life for householders, right? So less about like meditation and if I'll be less of a jerk because I've meditated more, and I'll be wiser, and I'll be less stressed, and I'll have no anxiety about the collapse of democracy and all the other things that that we think meditation is supposed to do. Less about that and more about how do I live in relationship with the community, life cycle rituals, things that look a lot more like quote unquote religion in that Western definition of religion. And that was one model of like how to integrate these teachings of liberation into the world. And now there's this other model, which I remember from learning from Sharon Salzberg that we could imagine like the ultimate goal being really setting down the burden and no longer being pushed and pulled by desire and aversion. But maybe we could just lean back a little bit. Like we're leaning forward into each moment, or fearing, like each terrible thing. And there could be just a sort of posture of leaning back. That's another way of navigating that. It's an intrinsic, there's no way to like have a mortgage and also be free from desire and aversion. I mean, just today, we could even do there's only a few people with screens on, so I won't do a full poll. So like, I wonder how many of us in the room just in the last 7 days have had to deal with like health insurance companies. Like I had to today, my insurance, right? Like I did. So today my prescription plan changed. My insurance thing, there was one prescription plan and shift to the other one. The only flaw with the new prescription plan is they didn't send me my prescriptions. So like it's like my partner likes to say, you had one job, which was to send the prescription, right? It's just like there is a way in which we can be present with these, comings and goings of daily life, but it's not going to be a pleasant, steady state that we have on a 7-day meditation retreat or a 3-month retreat, or living in that kind of conditioned environment. And finally, I would say in this little intro part, most of us practice what the scholar Donald McMahon says, or David McMahon, sorry, is called Buddhist modernism, which is the kind of insertion of Buddhism into a modern and now postmodern frame that really shifts. And I think his book, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, I find it really useful. It's a scholarly book, but I find it a really useful Dharma book. Because it just shows how first, a number of Burmese and Indian and Southeast Asian reformers changed what the Dharma was to respond to their conditions and to try to fight back against colonialism, and how that became inherited by the traditions that many of us probably are familiar with. In the last 30 years, that Buddhist modernism has been inserted into the wellness industry and into kind of late model capitalism. And the image for this, I'll let you each search for it if you want, rather than share my screen. If you just search Time magazine cover meditation, you'll see that every time Time magazine talks about meditation, they put a young, attractive, white, blonde-haired woman on the cover with a perfectly placid expression on her face. She is like everything that we want but don't have, right? And that's a really unrealistic, right? And I would even say anti-humanistic conception. Like if I were to put meditation on the cover, it would probably be some bad advertising, but it would be somebody who just experienced a loss in their life, maybe being comforted by somebody else or finding comfort themselves. It would be a really messy sit where it's difficult to kind of stay with it, but there's this healing ability to surrender and to let go and to allow and to be self-compassionate. I remember I was working at a meditation app for a while, the app 10% Happier, and my time working there overlapped with the beginning of the pandemic. Maybe I would put those pictures, like a Zoom grid, just like this one, about what meditation could be when people were really suffering. And it was possible for these practices of presence, surrender, relinquishment, acknowledgement, to really, really connect with people. The number one thing that we used to get at 10% Happier as feedback from people was, I can't meditate, my mind is too busy, it's not for me. It's not for me is fine. Everybody should decide if it's for them. I'm not saying meditation's for everyone, but there's definitely a deeply held belief that I blame Time Magazine's editors for, that what you're supposed to be able to do is quiet your mind and find your Zen. And that's the point. And if you do that, you've succeeded. And if you don't do that, that means you're a bad meditator, or you just can't meditate or something like that. I find that it's so disempowering that that's the model. And for me, I'll finish these last three or 4 minutes just with like what my own practice has been like. So now I'm a parent late in life, so I'm a little bit older. I'm a little bit old to have a 7-year-old daughter, but I have a 7-year-old daughter. And obviously that shifts how practice happens. Those of you, if you're parents of a human or non-human person or being in your life, you know that there's first the strains increase, but also the arena of practice really shifts. So I was really fortunate at an earlier time in my life, about 15, 16 years ago, to have a gap in both relationships. I just ended one relationship, and also in work. And at that time I thought, well, what do I most want to do? Oh, I want to just definitely go get enlightened. So I did a 2-month jhana retreat, and then I flew across the world to do a 3-month insight meditation retreat. And I look back on that time, and I'm so grateful that I just had that privilege. I just had that opportunity in life that I would, most people think I was nuts, but also a lot of people don't have that opportunity. But that's practice under a certain set of conditions. And it feels to me like the liberating insight is recognizing that everything is dependently originated causes and conditions. And when the conditions change, the nature of practice changes. So as a parent, and as somebody involved in, now I'm working as a law professor now. I've been a journalist for the last 15 years or so. There's not, the real teaching of non-self is like watching all of the treasured cliches of what meditation looks like and the Dharma life looks like be sort of just melt away, because they don't hold under all conditions. And so my opening thing I wanted to say about like what is realistic Dharma is that if there were a realistic Dharma, it's its own teaching, by which I mean seeing that how the Dharma lives in us changes with our conditions in a radical way. That actually is awakening. So it's a little bit like the Ananda story, right? By letting go of the image of like what the awakened life looks like, there might actually be a possibility for a softening, increase in our own compassion for ourselves and for others. And that's like this great irony, because I often tell my students when I'm teaching meditation to absolute beginners, I advise them to, fake it till you make it. Like just pretend like you know how to meditate. Like don't just fake it. Just sit there, and you sit still, and you don't really think you know what you're doing. And but eventually, like, with enough compassion, not a fake it till you make it, like with firmness, but just to play almost. But here you can't fake it till you make it. So for those of us who've been in a life of practice for a while, I've noticed a lot of fake surrendering that I do. Like, oh, I've let go, I'm fine. No, and but then there is like just lurking in there somewhere in the body mind system. Maybe it's some memory or some imprint that I should be like that female white blonde woman on the cover of Time magazine mixed with the Dalai Lama. And like because I'm not that way, there is like an element of like shaming that can happen and negation of my experience. So that's the trick question, I feel like, Dave, in the way that you framed it. Like, what is realistic dharma? In a way, that's like the perfected dharma. Like, if we're a nun or a monk and we find ourselves in that condition, it looks one way. But if we find ourselves in a different one, it looks another way. But it's not, it's like easy to say, but harder to live in an embodied way. Since that, like, that little, like, comparing mind is just so pernicious that I'm pleased that evolution has gifted me such a sharp tool as my ability to compare myself to others. All right, that's to you, Dave.
Thank you, Jay. Let me add pin. But I'm going to put this in here just for a moment so you can see it. You might remember this. I think I have it handy here. I did. Ah, yes, yes. There it is. The mindfulness revolution, 10 years ago now. 10 years ago now.
I know, maybe we're in the counter revolution already.
I know.
That revolution definitely was televised.
It was. It was. Yeah, I remember. I actually have a copy of that magazine somewhere. So
Do you
I
really?
really appreciate what Jay has to say. And I actually, as I look at my notes, they become less and less relevant after listening to you talk for a bit of time. But I really appreciate you reflecting on the Ananda Buddha story because in my practice, in my life, I've always felt really connected to Ananda. It's because of him we have all these texts. He was able to remember and regurgitate and really know these teachings, but he didn't make as much progress as others. And I always felt that was true for me. And so I've had to, and I continue to have to be honest with myself as for a realistic Dharma. And I ask myself this question regularly. What do I really hope? What do I really think I'm going to get out of this, really? Like Jay, I'm older in life. I have a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old. I at best meditate 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and maybe get on 1 or 2 retreats a year. That's not that much. And so what am I going to get out of that? And so when we think about how can these ideas of Buddhism and Dharma practice be misleading, I think it's a little bit important for me to just reflect on what do we mean by misleading and how have we been misled. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize growing up in a capitalistic society and growing up in America, when we hear of things like enlightenment or awakening, which I think are just kind of basically speaking to the same experience, we follow what we would call a product model because we follow product models in basically everything. And so enlightenment, awakening is the product. And what do I got to do to get the product? Well, I got to do these retreats and I got to read these books. And, I have to do all these things. And if I do all these things and I practice all these things, and over the course of my practice, there's going to be some kind of event. And during this event, there's going to be something's going to happen. I don't even know what the hell it is. And on the other side of that, things are going to be easy, pleasant. I don't even know, actually. A lot of us, we don't even think this through. We don't even know that we're playing into a product model, but we don't even know what the product is. And so then we can oftentimes feel, I'm glad Jay brought this up with 10%. It's like, I've been teaching meditation for years and I've interviewed and talked to thousands of people at this point. And I would say the number one thing that I hear people say about mindfulness is they don't feel like they're doing it correctly. I could never do that, or I could never get my mind to stop thinking, or whatever your little story is about how you're not doing it correctly. I think that's the number one thing. And then if you ask them, like, well, if you were doing it correctly, let's just assume you were doing it correctly, what would be happening? And I never actually get an answer to that question. And so there's so much of that I think, feelings in our society of undeserving or not good enough, or I don't really have what it takes. I'm somehow fundamentally flawed in some kind of way. I think that permeates our society and our culture to the point where I think the story that Jay brought up is so important with the Buddha. It's like, no, I do deserve this. I do deserve to be awake or to be enlightened or whatever that word is. And so when we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about some terms that I'm always putting all these descriptions, and I'll kind of say why you see the word Buddhism and the word Dharma. And I just want to speak to those. Those are very quite different things, I believe. Buddhism, without a doubt, is certainly a world's religion. It has its institutions, it has its dogmas, it's orthodox, it has its monastic settings, it has a lot of hallmarks that we see in traditional religion. And a lot of people, myself included, come into Dharma practice, and I'm actually not interested in a lot of that. But so I'm not really sure what to do with a lot of that. The funny thing for me was I was a traumatized, criminal teenager when I got into Dharma practice. And I used to at retreats at the Insight Meditation Society for quite a time. I sat quite a few 10 days retreats, and I didn't even know Buddhism was what was going on. I had no fucking idea. I thought I was doing this thing called Vipassana, like, I don't know. I didn't know that there was a Buddhist overtone. And I actually credit IMS for, not making it so obvious. And so at the same time, I mean, I certainly have a deep respect and a deep reverence, and I deeply appreciate the Buddhist tradition, although I don't feel like I fit comfortably there. I don't call myself a Buddhist. I did at times, but never with any degree of comfort. And I also feel like it's important to be rooted in a tradition. I very much feel rooted in a tradition, the Insight tradition in my case, but I also don't want to be stuck in that tradition. And so when I think about what the Dharma is, which is a very difficult word to translate, it's much more nuanced. It's more about how things come to be, how do things happen, and what is it that we might be able to do about that. And so the setup again, I think between, and I never heard anybody say that before, but I'm going to steal that from you, Jay, because I think the story is really good that we have this Buddha that kind of is the perfection model, and we have the kind of Ananda that's like, well, he didn't quite get it. And it's like, I really feel like I didn't quite get it, story. And so we could say that, like, a lot of times the monastic model is really about purification and transcendence. It's about kind of trying to get to this other experience. And I feel that for me, and the Ananda path is really more about what's relevant and what's transformative. What is the life that I've chosen to live for myself? I don't live in a monastery. I live in a very complicated world. And I take that with great seriousness. And one of the things I think that we could also say about the Dharma, I think that's important, is again, almost impossible word to translate. There's a whole bunch of other words that are almost synonymous with that, which would be, one of them would be Nibbana or Nirvana, the term that awakening or enlightenment comes from. The Third Noble Truth, this kind of mental state, this kind of way of being in the being mode. Mindfulness, this is how the Buddha woke up, through the practice of mindfulness. Things like awakening and equanimity. And when you look at probably the most famous discourse that you hear about, especially in the insight world, around the Buddha's experience of awakening, is that of the Four Noble Truths, and that he awoke. And usually people skip the first part of that sutta, which is kind of the best part, which is he awoke to a middle way that avoids dead ends. And the middle way is really synonymous with the Eightfold Path. And so we can kind of see, I think that this concept of the middle way is very relevant, insanely relevant to the world that we live in right now, because there is not a lot of people in the middle. We've been driven to extremes socially, politically, in ways that are just kind of outstanding and tragic. And this middle way idea, the Buddha calls these extremes. Sometimes they're called extremes. The word is actually antaka, which literally means dead end. Their views, their opinions, their habits, their things, they're like a cul-de-sac. They don't go anywhere. They just go round and round and round. The other word we would see is the word samsara, which means to go round and round and round. And I don't know about you, but I find myself often in my own mind in these properties and neighborhoods psychologically where I'm just going round and round and round and I'm not getting anywhere. And that is the hallmark of not middle. This kind of rounding business. And so we can really benefit by trying to figure out how can we be more middle? How can I look at the world, embrace the world that I live in without A, becoming overwhelmed, because that's no good, but can I also not disconnect? What you want to try to be in the middle, try that one. I mean, in many ways, that's the clinical definition of compassion, is to be in touch with the pain of ourself or others of the world and to not be overwhelmed by that pain, but also not needing to disconnect from that pain. And that is not easy. That is not easy, but that, to me, that's realistic. I feel like I can strive for that. I feel like I can see that that would be beneficial. And I can see a lot of people being like, almost critical of that. My mom is very unhappy with the state of the world right now. And she more or less called me a Trumper last week because I wasn't totally pissed off about a whole number of items. And I was like, wow, if I'm not totally angry, I'm just on the other side now. It's like, wow, man, like that happened really, really fast. And so I think one of that, one of the things that we can think about is how can a realistic Dharma might actually be an authentic Dharma or something. Yeah, we could do that. Authentic Dharma in the sense of, what do you think you're going to get out of this? And that might be different for everybody. And I think there's actually value in struggling with that question. I think there's a lot of value in struggling with that question. There has been for me of like, sometimes I sit on the cushion in the morning and I'll still have to myself, I'm like, really, this again? It's gonna fucking sit here for 30 minutes and like do what? What am I getting out of this? So I think there's value in that. So I'm going to stop there and we're going to change up a bit. And I'm going to give it back to Jay for question number 2. How can we balance aspiration and realism when it comes to making progress in ethics, meditation, mindfulness, in our overall relationship to the world?
Thanks. Yeah, it was that last phrase, the overall relationship to the world, that made me wanna, as I was listening to you, want to kind of reflect on that a little bit. There's an old, I guess it's a cliche or whatever it is, a saying that religion, when it's done well, comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Funny thing is, it actually started in reference to journalism, which since as a spiritual teacher, journalist, I like that I get both sides. That good journalism comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. I think even those of us who aren't angry about every single thing that's happening in our public lives, there's a lot of affliction, right? I mean, we've been living in some kind of a poly crisis now for maybe the better part of a decade. And it was that, I think the realistic piece too has really come up for me in the last few months. Because I'm not going to talk about politics in this space, but just I will talk about how we might feel about politics. I feel like the same unrealistic expectation of self has also I've noticed has sort of shown up in an unrealistic expectation of society and societal power. Like, gosh, it's 10 years since that nice young woman was on the cover of Time magazine. Shouldn't we be better off? Shouldn't we be doing better than this? It shouldn't, like, really, we're still like, shouldn't we as a culture be doing better than this? And yeah, in one sense, I want to say yes, of course. I think personally, we as a culture should be doing a lot better than this. And yet, what I found like most realistic and helpful in the Dharma for the last 4 months or so has been precisely the parts of the Dharma that I used to really dislike. The kind of anti-humanistic seeming pieces, the sort of seemingly pessimistic pieces. I remember one time I was also on a meditation retreat, and there was a teacher who A friend of mine described him as an Orthodox Buddhist, which was perfect. As soon as my friend said that, like a lot of my struggle with this teacher like relaxed. I was like, oh yeah, he's just Orthodox. Like he's just a fundamentalist. Like, oh, okay. Anyway, he told some story of like, you know how when you go on meditation retreat and you come back, you're a little bit more sensitive to things, and it can be quite beautiful. And so he was a big Deadhead, and he went to a Grateful Dead show like a few days after some meditation retreat, and he described how terrible it was, and so loud, and everything was awful. And then he went on to describe like how food was awful, and actually realized that everything in life was awful, and that was a big teaching of the Buddha, and this is great. And I was like, I was a lot younger then too. I was in my 30s, and I was like, shut up. Right, with this like anti-humanistic, cynical, world-hating, renunciatory stuff, and like I want to live, I want to. And now I still am not in that I'm not in that quite that place, but a lot of the sort of pessimism in some of the Dharmic teachings about the resilience of greed, hatred, and delusion, and a lot of the kind of, it's sort of the renunciatory aspect of just saying like, these factors, this is the nature, like suffering is the nature of samsara. Suffering caused by clinging, suffering caused by aversion, suffering caused by delusion, right? Just a different word for greed, hatred, and delusion. Like that is the nature of what it is to be human. It's not the only aspect of what there is to be human, right? There's also like, really good concerts and love and relationship and art, but it is a sort of unavoidable aspect. And I've found these, like, some would call them pessimistic, but I do think it's part of the realistic Dharma, that it just to that words of that question, like how we balance, it's not quite here that like the ambition and but like how we balance the sacred, I would say, desire to alleviate suffering and to make a better world, with a kind of understanding that that's not going to happen in the short term, right? And that the extreme suffering that we see around us now, and that is going to increase in the short to mid-term period of time, is that is samsara. Like that's why we do the work. Right, so not as a like quietism, not as like, okay, I give up, but right, there's that, it's so like the compassion that I hope to develop really makes life worse right now, right? It's like if the more compassionate you are toward people who are suffering, the less you can put up with the cruelty that is increasingly a part of our public sphere, right? And then that can be balanced in a certain way by the wisdom of just like, yeah, this is why the Buddha dedicated his life. You would think like after you get enlightened, you said, Dave, like what do you expect will happen on the other side, the other shore, of the river, to use the Buddhist metaphor. And it's like, well, geez, maybe I'll just like retire and like go to Bali, and just like live like a really chill life. Like this heroic figure, whether he existed or not in the text, made this opposite decision. He's like, wow, now that I've achieved, this great thing, or like achieved is probably the wrong word, but whatever. Now that I've like released out of suffering myself, I feel the suffering of others more. So I'm going to like spend all of this time, then my next 40 years of life, says the Buddha, trying to help in a certain way with the full understanding on the wisdom. So that's the compassion side, with the full understanding on the wisdom side that like, this will take thousands of years if we make it that long, right? And again, like part of me kind of recoils against that. But again, in just the last few months, like there's really been a real consolation in that. Like there's many ways in which the moment that we're in now is unprecedented. It's unprecedented in American history. Climate change is an unprecedented existential threat for the entire planet, right? AI is an unprecedented threat toward how we see ourselves as valuable human beings for the large majority of some people anyway, large number of people who are connect that to work and to their ability to sustain themselves. So like some of these things in our world are very new, right? But some are not new. Like we have been here before, right? The texts of the Dharma were written in various different places and times, but the one thing they all had in common was like they were all seriously fucked up, right? Like warring princes in the north of India, or Tibet constantly being in some degree of conflict even within itself, right? There were key dharmic texts written in periods of instability in Japan and in Thailand and in Korea, and also Western dharmic texts as well. Like engaged Buddhism comes in the context of seeing extreme suffering, and that for me has been what's really been up for me. A kind of sadness, but it's sadness. I wrote a book about sadness, so I'm going to try not to do the whole book right now, but sadness is not a hindrance, right? In the classic five hindrances, which hindrances are things which get in the way of your being present, or getting in the way of your being able to meditate, right? Or to just be present. Sadness is not one of those things, right? We can hold intense grief and sadness on a personal level or on a collective level while still being present and doing the practice as we understand it. And so I really there's been a real sadness for me, but it hasn't gotten in the way, I would say, of me being the person I want to be with my family or in my other relationships or in my work life. So it's not like I have a superpower. There've definitely been a lot of sleepless nights, and I probably haven't gotten a good night's sleep in close to 6 months at this point. But there is that leaning back, right? That's that balance of how I think the world should be. And because of my values in this moment, again, not assuming everyone shares every value, but because of my own values, we seem to be moving farther and farther away from what I think the should of the world is, or what I'd like to see. And so there's a real surrendering there that's coupled with not surrendering, right? So the surrendering is to what is, and the not surrendering is continuing to try to do the work wherever it's possible to alleviate suffering. And those two, there's a great quote. I could Google it maybe while you're talking if I don't listen. But I think it was it's either Wei Wu Wei or no, I think it's Nisargadatta, the great non-dual sage Nisargadatta, it is him. And it was wisdom tells me I'm nothing, love tells me I'm everything, in between my life flows. It's that wisdom of seeing through phenomena, and that this self is empty, and that there's everything is just empty, right? But then there's love, seeing this consciousness as part of the whole, as part of everything. And the big I, this is in a Hindu phrase, right? Or if there's an Orthodox Buddhist who doesn't like talking about the I apologize. But in the Hindu understanding of Atman and Brahman, the big Atman, the one, and love connects me, and in between my life flows. That's the key. That's the kicker, right? That it's that oscillation of openness, and which brings pain, and a little bit of stepping back, which brings some consolation and some wisdom. And then back pendulating and titrating back and forth, just like with a trauma-informed mindfulness lens, getting a little closer to it, a little bit farther away. And that for me is that's why I was chomping at the bit to build on what you just said, Dave, because it feels very up for me right now. And it has actually worked. It hasn't made the world that much better, except insofar as it's enabled me to function better and thus show up for people. And that includes people who are close to me, but also, I'm part of the queer community. I have a lot of trans friends who are justifiably feeling really threatened right now. And I've been able to kind of show up for them in ways that have been hard at times, because there's that little bit of inner peace that is in that dynamic relationship with the opposite of peace. All right, Dave, back to you. I feel like we're doing sports casting. Back to you, Dave, at the 50-yard line.
And we're back. Thank you, Jay. That was a nice shift. I appreciate that. When I saw that come up in the chat, I was like, yeah, that makes sense to me. So yes, I like everything you're saying. I just want to put my cards a little bit more cleanly on the table for a moment and just talk about trauma for a moment. I lived a great majority of my life with fairly clinical grade symptoms of PTSD. and really feeling like the world was a tragic, terrible, unsafe place that I needed to fucking tolerate until I finally died. And so I used copious amounts of drugs and alcohol for many, many years to try to mitigate that. So I practice what I call Star Wars Dharma. And that means I have a personal policy where I'm not allowed to go to the dark side. I just don't go to the dark side. I just totally can't. It's just really bad for me. Now, I say all of that to also admit to the fact that I actually do go to the dark side. And I work really, really, really hard every day to not do that. And there is, I'm glad Jay talked about this pessimism side of Buddhism because it's certainly part of it, but I don't think it's the message. I think it's just the Buddha being radically honest about the human dilemma. I was teaching at Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma this summer, and I was reading. David Loy has a book called Eco Dharma, which you haven't read it. I suggest you do. It's quite good. And there's a chapter in there where he's like, like we might destroy the planet. Like this actually might not fucking pan out. Like we, as practicing Buddhists, really need to wrestle with the fact of like, yeah, this ship might go down, and we might not be able to come out of this. And there's actually a radical teaching in all of that. And one of the things that's been really helpful for me as living with a traumatized brain is that, and I did a lot of this work in therapeutic settings where, my big fear is, the hypervigilant feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then waking up to the idea, the realistic reality that the other shoe is actually going to drop. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I'll be okay when it does. And more importantly, I'm okay right now. Right now, I'm okay. And we know, of course, in the mindfulness world, the attention to the present moment experience is certainly a key factor. And it's like, okay, like I think there's something actually very punk rock and very kind of revolutionary about actually being okay now. The world does not need more suffering people. Like, I think that's pretty clear. And I think one of the things that I can do, that we can do as practitioners is, in the face of all of what might be happening, is how can we live a balanced, meaningful, contented life in the face of that? And not to feel bad about that. That is not a disconnection. That is not sticking our head in the sand. That is not spiritual bypass. That is actually possible. And to me, that's the middle way. That's the middle way, is that how can I, be an agent of positive change in the world? How can I spread more light onto the people that I see every day? How can I help people be more optimistic? And I think that that's really, not everybody would agree with this. One thing about Buddhism is nobody agrees about anything, which makes it so fun, is that I think the Dharma path, the view, as the Buddha talks about, right view, is one of optimism. It's one of what's possible. And when we have to square the circle on this, I think we have to do both. I think we have to be honest and realistic about the limitations of our humanity, in which there's many. We might not make it. Greed, hatred, and delusion might actually win. And by all appearances, it's doing pretty good right now. If I could buy stock in greed, hatred, and delusion, I'd be tempted to do so. But that doesn't mean I'm going to throw in the towel. So I think we have to be really honest about the limitations of the world that we live in, but we also have to be optimistic about what's possible, about what we can do, And I think one of the outcomes of practice, and this is one of the reasons why I think mindfulness, and there's been many people who are critical of mindfulness. Orthodox Buddhists tend to be the most critical people of mindfulness, frankly. I think the mindfulness revolution, for all the stuff we've said about it, is a really good thing. I'm glad that mindfulness is as popular as it's become. And I think it's become as popular is because it works. People who practice it experience benefits from it. And it's really, really difficult because the progression, not the product model, the progression model is usually we find that we cultivate something like mindfulness, we go on a retreat, we do an MBSR class, whatever it is, we initially get a pretty big relief. I hear this all the time. That was my experience. And for my case, it was a gigantic relief. And then soon after the big relief, as Jack Cornfield writes, after the ecstasy of the laundry, right? It's like, after the big relief, you're like, oh shit, I have to like there's more stuff to do here. And I think what it does, and this word it has been a buzzword, it's kind of gone away now, but I'll bring it back because I think it's a good word, is resilience, is it helps us become resilient. And in Goleman's work, Dan Goleman, the emotional intelligence writer, talks about resilience as the recovery time of how long does it take us to recover from a perceived setback. And I think the key word here is perceived setback. And right now, I think a lot of people, myself included, really feel like we got set back pretty far. The pendulum has really swung the other way. And it's like, so what are we going to do in that present moment space? How do I want to be in the Heidegger way? Being in the world talks about this. The existentialists talk about this stuff all the time. How do I want to be in the midst of all this? Do I want to have mindfulness? Do I want to have equanimity? Do I want to try to promote kindness? How do I want to be in this without going to the dark side? And so, it's really this interesting practice for me right now. And this has been true for me and a lot of people I work with. It's like, if there was ever a time to double down on your Dharma practice or really think to yourself, how seriously do I take this practice? It's right about now. It's really right about now is a really good time to wrestle with these ideas and trying to find this compassionate mental state where it's like, how do I care without becoming overwhelmed or disconnecting? And maybe in that and in that I find myself I do get overwhelmed actually. And when I get overwhelmed, it helps zero people. Nobody benefits from me being overwhelmed. I can assure you. I'll go get my wife. She's in the room. She can attest to how me being overwhelmed helps zero people. And also disconnecting. I mean, like, I know that the weird thing about the phone, is like I use my phone to disconnect and then I just disconnect into more of the bullshit I'm trying to be disconnected from. Like, I don't know what's up with that, but that's insane. I'm like, I can't take it. I need to, I go to disconnect and then I end up like just looking at more stuff to be overwhelmed by. So you can't even.
It was funny that you said, you have a thing, don't go to the dark side, because every so often Dave will text me some like horrible thing that somebody has said that I had no idea about. Like, oh, did you just see blah, 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 blah. And yeah, you're like, you live on the dark side, man. You're like, all the podcasts I never, ever, ever check for because of my own spiritual hygiene. I feel like you listen to.
Well, I'm trying to get other people to pull me out. I'm like, I'm going in, man. I'm going in. You got to keep me from going in. This person said that. So we have a few minutes left. I want to also, because I did want to give Jay the last word here, and I think I'm about there with what I wanted to say. Jay, why don't you wrap it up for us before we open it up to other people for questions and just see. I'd be really curious to see how you're sitting with everything that we said or that we discussed, or kind of what's on your mind here for the last maybe 10 minutes or so.
It's funny. What's resonating with me, and this part's the unprepared part, because it keeps it real when we're spontaneously responding a little bit, is actually something you said that's just like really obvious, but I don't know why it's hitting me in a way, which was just your comment a few minutes ago that now's a good time to double down on practice. Like duh, right? But somehow, like, actually, I don't know why that's landing so well for me, but like it's like penetrating a little bit, just because I think there's when we are, human animals, we're all, well, I don't know, a lot of us are really going through a lot, right? And when that happens, there's a tendency to kind of close inward to, fight, flight, freeze stuff, right? Or like, how do I, manage my anxiety so that, like, again, I can get a good night's sleep or something like that. And like, those are all, I'm not judging those reactions at all, right? I mean, those are sort of evolutionarily designed reactions that are there for a reason and that really can help us. But it's also easy to see how that takes away from like things which don't seem as essential, right? So like, okay, well, I'm too busy like dealing with stuff. Like, I'm not going to meditate, or I'm not going to even do the work, or even if I do meditate, I'm going to just stay on the breath. I'm not going to allow in any of the painful stuff, because I just gotta get through it, right? There's like but and again, I'll repeat, I'm not judging that as as a response. Like it makes sense that that would be the response, but it's a shame if that happens, right? Because I see how I would be cutting off. It's almost cutting off the things which sustain me. It's almost like making space for self-care. I think about, like, it's a little bit overused, but that famous quote from Audre Lorde, that in a society, so Audre Lorde, black queer feminist thinker, poet, writer, leader from active mostly in the 70s, 1970s and 80s, said something like, for me, like self-care is a form of resistance or a form of revolution. I'm forgetting the exact words, which I apologize for, but someone can Google it. And what she was saying is, like, given who I am, this is Audre Lorde speaking, in this body with these identities, taking care of myself is part of, like, that is part of the work. That is part of the activism. It's easy to see that going too far, right? So I'm a little more comfortable than, Audre Lorde probably was in the 1970s and 80s. So, like, but I'm going to take myself to the spa again because that's part of the revolution. So it's easy to see going too far in that direction. But at least for me, I find myself more on the other side, like not taking the space to do the self-care stuff because, I'm just trying to hold it together. I'm just trying to, do this or that. And so that's what's kind of landing with me. It's interesting too. I think when I think about the middle way, it doesn't quite reflect my experience. I think, like, the phrase I would use would be like the constantly oscillating, dynamically, always out of balance way, but somehow maybe landing toward the mean.
Sure.
So, like, and actually it's funny, I come from a lot of different spiritual traditions in the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. That's how there's like that chart of the tree of life, and it looks like everything is balanced and symmetrical, but actually it's because things are constantly tilting in one way and then tilting the other way. So that's my middle way, is like having some navigational North Star as I zoom from one extreme to, not one extreme to the other, but just one sense of imbalance to the other, and seeing what's wise in any particular moment. So that goes back to that comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. It's a sobering time. I don't know how many of you all here also are teachers in this space, or Dharma teachers, or in any other kind of modality, or therapists or mental health workers, but it's like the best of times, the worst of times, mostly the worst of times, but like you definitely can make like you're making an impact, right? Because in this moment, there are a lot of people really hurting. And again, if you're a mental health practitioner, or if you're taking care of somebody, you don't need me to say that, but just, it really is like the value of these tools. And I've thought about it too, like, without minimizing the gravity of this moment, we can also realize that there have also been really, really hard moments across human history that are a lot worse, right? I mean, there are people who were enslaved for their lives, right? There were people who, like, lived in a time, for the vast majority of human history before there was modern medicine, with, a high infant mortality rate and a low life expectancy. Like, I'm not minimizing anything that we're going through now, but it's from a dharmic perspective, I found it really helpful to, like, remember the circumstances that were around that gave birth to the world's wisdom traditions. And without sugarcoating this moment or shaming myself for, like, feeling bad or crappy about this moment, just gaining some of that comfort in the affliction from that. There's nothing more realistic than that. Right, the wheel of samsara, powered by suffering. That feels like that's some real stuff.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I remember that. It's easy to forget, but I remember being in third grade and watching The Day After, that nuclear Holocaust movie. And I remember being in school the next day. I remember in the 80s, I was totally convinced that we were going to die at any moment from
I watched it
nuclear
I guess I'm 1 year or 2 years old. I think it was in fifth grade. And, like, that thing gave me nightmares. And then I was also sure, like, that was what was going to happen. I was like, there was that scene where they're, like, in the car. Actually, it was partly my dad's fault. We watched that movie, and, like, I guess it was Jason Robards or some character, like, hid in the car, as, like, the blast was happening. And I asked my dad if he was safe because he was, like, ducking down in the car. And my dad said something like, he's been totally penetrated by, a ton of radiation. He's certainly going to die.
No, the car did not save Jason Robards. Yeah, and I remember feeling that way with most of my elementary school. I'm like any day now. And so I think that there's a way. The one thing I just want to say before we open it up is like, it's okay to enjoy life in the midst of all that's happening. And maybe it's even more important to do so. So we're going to take some questions